Anlatmadın mı?
Yok, ben almadım.
Kartın var mı yanında?
Gibt es noch was zu essen? Gibt es noch was zu futtern?
Ich war jetzt gerade, wir hatten gerade mit den Amerikanern Mittagessen.
Hier gibt es noch was zu essen, nichts, ne?
Drüben, die waren drüben, die waren im Parlament lokal.
Da gibt es das.
Aber da gibt es auch was. Also ich hab's auch, hier oben ist noch ein Lokal.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I trust you lunched both well and wisely. There are one or two pieces of housekeeping before we move on. The first is, and we'll hear a little bit more about this in a moment or two, that Raynel Andrzejczyk, who's sitting on my right, who's the reporter of the Subcommittee on NATO Partnerships, will unhappily not be able to continue after this session as she's leaving the Canadian Senate, and therefore it's necessary for a temporary successor to be nominated to present not the draft report, which is what we're considering today, but the final report at the session in London in October. And for that purpose, it is appropriate to nominate someone on an interim basis. This is not a permanent appointment, because all permanent appointments are made in the autumn meeting of the Assembly. Mr. Miro Kovac of Croatia has indicated that he'd be willing to take up this responsibility between now and October, and indeed to present the final version of the report. So I seek your endorsement of the proposal that I should nominate him for that purpose, so as to ensure the smooth running of the events in London, but also to ensure that we have someone who's familiar between now and then with the contents of the final completed report. So may I have your endorsement of that? I take that as being assent. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm now about to call Mr. Droba, who's a former member of the permanent delegation of the National Council of the Republic of Slovakia to the NATO PA, who's asked for the opportunity to make a contribution for some 5 minutes to reflect his previous experience of the Parliamentary Assembly and his wishes for it.
Thank you, Min. Ladies and gentlemen, as an alumnus and the former head of the Slovakian delegation, I'm happy to address you. I'm the governor who understands the defense and security issues and who became an alumnus, therefore still very loyal to this honorable organization of people. You are back to Bratislava after 15 years. It's very symbolic because we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution from 1989. And we are organizing the PA NATO summit in the country which used to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Thanks God, the situation is different in Slovakia now, and we are finally where we belonged, culturally, socially, and geographically, despite the pitiful 40 years of communist history. Even more, we realize that defense and peace is not granted. Some hundreds of kilometers from our eastern border, there is a real military conflict, which shows us that the conventional threats are real and much closer than we would have thought some years ago. Even more, on the daily basis, we see that the massive and effective attacks on our values are going and are full alive. These are the attacks against the values of peace, democracy, human rights, freedom, and justice, which are the founding stones of our society. We have to take the hybrid threats really seriously until it's too late. The current political situation in Europe doesn't play in our cards, and the tendencies are very dangerous. Extremism, fascism, and the movements which accompany these two things are very, very alive and very noisy. And let's not lie to ourselves. We know that the political parties which connect these movements have very strong links to one country which is outside our alliance and whose goals are very clear. They want to internally destroy our alliance and they want to threaten our society. It's up to us, the politicians, to do everything not to allow these streams to win again, and we need to fight in order to be like at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 80s. It's obvious that we are on the threshold of the new Cold War, And if we like it or not, we have to take it as a fact, and we have to do everything to win again and keep our values. Look, the Slovaks don't live by the NATO or defense matters. Normal people really don't care. We are lucky to have peaceful borders. In my meetings as a governor of the region, voters rarely voice any concerns about the defense issues. That presents a challenge. If people start taking security for granted, support for NATO will naturally ebb away. So how do we present the alliance as a good thing? That's a real challenge in Slovakia these days. Here is my short list. The more NATO does for Ukraine, the more popular the alliance can be in Slovakia. I can credibly make the argument that as Ukraine grows richer and more stable, the East Slovakia will prosper because we can trade and gain new markets. At present, the cross-border between Slovakia and Ukraine is really negligible. And my second recommendation is unfortunately a negative one, what we should not do. Let's not threaten our allies with the car tariffs and trade wars. That plays very badly here. We are a completely open economy and Slovakia prospers mostly from car exports. When the source of growth disappears, the economy is in trouble. And it's really hard to understand that one of our allies, historically one of our best allies, should be the one making these threats. That always rebounds on the NATO reputation, because people ask, why are we allies with someone who threatens our well-being? Well, enough said. I'm very happy that you came to my hometown and you came to my region. I hope you see the difference between now and 2004. And I hope that the negotiations and the meeting will be a great overall success. Welcome to Slovakia, welcome to Bratislava, and thank you for your attention. Min, did I make it?
You most certainly did, and
okay,
thank you very much
Thanks.
for your contribution. You can take the boy out of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, but you can't take the Parliamentary Assembly out of the boy. Now, the next item on the agenda is the consideration of the draft general report, Security and Stability in Africa, Challenges and Opportunities for NATO, which was due to be presented by Julio Calha of Portugal, who's the general rapporteur. Unhappily, he had to go back to home for an engagement that he could not break, and as a result, he has asked Rainiel Andrzejczyk to present his draft report on security and stability in Africa. And of course, if you look at the next item on the agenda, Rainiel has the responsibility of presenting her own report. But before we ask her to fulfill these dual obligations, I just want to say a word or two about her and about someone else who's here this afternoon. There are two long-standing members of the committee who will be leaving us after this session. Rainiel, because she ceases to be a member of the Canadian Senate. She first joined the Assembly in 2000, and I have seen with my own eyes how active a member of the political committee she has been since then. She served in virtually every possible position: rapporteur of a subcommittee, general rapporteur, chairperson of the committee, and with the Assembly she also served as the GSM rapporteur and was a vice chairperson, as well as co-chair of the Ukraine-NATO Interparliamentary Council. We have been extremely fortunate to have you in our midst, Rainiel, and we've all benefited greatly from your experience and your wisdom. You come to us with the background of having been first a judge and then a diplomat. And I rather suspect that you found both of these experiences of great assistance when dealing with the occasionally difficult members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. But we wish to thank you for your years of contribution and to wish you every good fortune in the years that are to come. And the second person who's leaving us, I don't know if she regards it as promotion or not, but I know she's already expressing some regrets. And that is Raza. I apologize. I've been rehearsing, I promise you. Yukenovicene. How's that? That's not bad. Raza, as you all know, has been a very prominent member of the Assembly since she was first first appointed to it in 1999. And like Renel, she's held a number of senior positions. Rapporteur of the Subcommittee on NATO Partnerships, General Rapporteur, so that you've followed in each other's footsteps. And then she was called to serve as the Minister of National Defense in the Lithuanian government. When she came back to the Assembly in 2012, she continued to be an active and highly valued contributor to the work of this committee, but to other parts of the Assembly too. And she has the honor and the deserved distinction of having been the first female president of the Assembly, and indeed the first president from what is referred to in my notes as a new country, but there are no longer such things as new countries. Everyone who joins is a member, and a member in full right. Razi, your comments and contributions have always enriched our dialogue. We know it will be difficult for anyone who follows you to fill your shoes. We know too that your enthusiasm for Macy's and other emporiums will be unabated by being in Brussels. It might even be encouraged. That's a rather in-joke. She will understand. We congratulate you on your election, and we wish you good fortune in the new Parliament of the European Union, which I think I can safely say is unlikely to be like any other parliament in the European Union that we have any of us experienced. Ladies and gentlemen, Renel and Raza. And now to business. Renel, you are going to deal with the, just get it right, the draft general report, Security and Stability in Africa, of which Julio Calya is the general rapporteur, and you're presenting it on his behalf. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind words. It's been my pleasure to be able to serve from Canada to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. When I first came, we had to constantly remind everyone that the transatlantic link included Canada. I'm very pleased to see that over the years we no longer have to do that, that I think so many of us were able to serve in so many capacities that I hope I've given a bit and the rest of the Canadian delegation has done their bit to put Canada firmly within the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And for that service, I'm extremely grateful. I've become very much enriched in the areas that were of concern to me before I got here. It gave me a platform and a place with so many friends that I'll take with me. And I'll probably have more time to visit you, because one of the things you find is all of us say to each other, come and visit, and we all mean it, but we don't do it. I now threaten you that I will do it. I'll have more time to do so. So thank you for the kind words. As you can see, I'm not Julio. He has a certain style and presentation, so I will try and do justice to his opening remarks. I was told that I would be filling his shoes. Well, I'm not sure what size his shoes are, so I'm not even going to try that. But I'll do my best to be as comprehensive and succinct to his report and then field any questions. The topic of the report was Security and Stability in Africa, Challenges and Opportunities for NATO. The report follows up on the Political Committee's earlier work on NATO's southern neighborhood. However, this report focuses in on sub-Saharan Africa more closely than the previous report. The latest events in the MENA region are considered primarily in the context of instability further south. And I understand there are slides that are accompanying all of these. It would be impossible to cover all the recent security developments in this vast and complex area in the committee report. I therefore chose to pay particular attention to those African issues that affect NATO and individual allies the most. We live in an age in which challenges in one part of the world can easily spill over and affect the lives of many others in another part of the world. This report examines conflict, terrorism, disease, migratory flows, and criminality in parts of Africa, as well as their impact on our own countries. It argues that NATO must improve its awareness of these security developments. Further, it encourages the alliance to deepen its cooperation with relevant security actors in Africa, notably the African Union, the United Nations, and the EU. NATO is not heavily involved in African affairs and should not be. However, greater intelligence sharing between allies, NATO partner countries, and other international organizations is key to ensuring that NATO is adequately prepared to face the challenges on the southern flank. I aim to expand on opportunities for such cooperation in the updated draft and will present, and that will be Mr. Julio will do that in London in October. Now, let me try to summarize the report very briefly. Terrorism, illegal migration, and human trafficking continue to affect the Middle East and North Africa. The number of terrorist attacks in this region has fallen in the past few years due to the demise of Daesh. However, returning Daesh fighters represent a potential new threat. Otherwise, the biggest danger is posed by terrorist groups in Libya and by Daesh in the Sinai province of Egypt. Libya remains torn by violence and political instability. In April, General Haftar's Libyan National Army began a multi-pronged attack on Tripoli. This chaos enables the flow of weapons, fuel, and drugs across Libya's borders. An EU deal with the Libyan Coast Guard stemmed illegal migration from Libya's shores, but there continues to be a lucrative people smuggling business in Libya's southern deserts. Also, the EU has warned that current fighting in Libya could trigger a new refugee crisis. A country in the region that is embroiled in even greater chaos is Yemen, where conflict has raged for the past 4 years. The report explores recent developments in Yemen. It assesses the moderate but insufficient progress in implementing last December's Stockholm Agreement and points out the relevance of this conflict for the regional balance of power. Of course, we must emphasize the catastrophic humanitarian cost of this war. The main challenges facing other countries in the MENA region are economic and social. High unemployment rates, demographic pressures, corruption, and rising prices spur criminality and radicalization. These factors are very much present in the sub-Saharan African region too, and it is a region that I will now turn to discuss. In recent years, a growing number of sub-Saharan African countries have been affected by terrorist attacks. A broad belt of jihadist campaigns now connects Kenya and Somalia in the east with Burkina Faso and Senegal in the west, as well as Niger, Nigeria, and Mali in between. The number of attacks carried out along this belt rose by over 300% between 2010 and 2017. The most prominent perpetrators include Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and Daesh. These militant groups have ideological links to extremist organizations in the Middle East, but are fundamentally grounded in local communities and grievances. Despite poverty, social exclusion, institutional collapse, government brutality, and lack of public services are the prevailing causes of radicalization in Africa. Several African extremist groups espouse an anti-Western ideology and target Western-linked establishments. Furthermore, a corridor which transports weapons, militants, and revenues between North Africa and the Sahel could form. This would further increase the risks of African terrorism for NATO. As a result, NATO must strengthen its support for international organizations and individual allies that are conducting counterterrorism and peacekeeping campaigns in Africa. Another challenge that links Africa and NATO countries is drug trafficking. According to the United Nations, an estimated 2/3 of the cocaine that is smuggled from Latin America to Europe makes a stop in West Africa. 87% of the total global seizures of pharmaceutical opioids in 2016 also occurred in Africa. This is particularly worrying given that extremist groups often rely on the drug trade for revenue. Furthermore, we must pay close attention to piracy, which is currently affecting the Gulf of Guinea in particular. Multiple kidnappings for ransom and attempted attacks on oil tankers occur in the Gulf's waters. NATO must take this threat seriously, given that these waters hold about 4.5% of the world's oil reserves. The economic cost of piracy in terms of oil theft and insurance costs is huge. Illegal migration and human trafficking are two other key security issues in the Sahel and North Africa that NATO should follow. We all saw the difficulties created for allies by the large-scale influx of migrants and refugees in 2015 and 2016. Although numbers have fallen sharply since then, the push factors motivating people to leave their homes in NATO's southern neighborhood have not changed. There is a significant likelihood in future surges in migration across sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean. Moreover, many migrants endure forced labor, torture, or sexual violence at the hands of their traffickers or squalid conditions in Libyan detention camps and elsewhere. It is obviously in our interest to address these problems. The UN Security Council declared that the Ebola epidemic that ravaged West Africa a few years ago a threat to the international peace and security. At the moment, the world's second largest Ebola outbreak is affecting eastern DRC. Infectious diseases have been destabilizing local effects and can spread rapidly across our interconnected world. And as an aside, I should say that I've been recently briefed to indicate that this danger is more than we've really paid attention to, and it will spread not in ways that we thought to neighboring countries, but in fact can spread rapidly in our interconnected world. They could also be weaponized for bioterrorism purposes. This all means we need to act quickly to prevent the emergence of pandemics in Africa and beyond. We should also be concerned about state fragility in Africa and the decentralized violence at state peripheries that it produces. Persistent instability in countries like DRC and the Central African Republic has transnational effects. It spills across borders, creates large refugee populations, fuels trafficking networks, and encourages the spread of extreme ideology. We must do our best to prevent this by bolstering weak central governments and supporting local peacekeeping missions. NATO devotes considerably more time and resources to North than sub-Saharan Africa. Through its Mediterranean dialogue and its maritime missions in the Mediterranean, NATO is active in tackling challenges facing the MENA region. It is only recently that NATO has demonstrated more interest in sub-Saharan Africa. At the Brussels summit last year, the Allies defined their objectives for the South more explicitly. They also described the hub for the South in Naples fully operational. But we can and must do more. Staffing and funding arrangements for the hub have not yet been fully developed, and its geographical mandate is still unclear. Although we have strengthened our cooperation with multilateral security actors in Africa, this is still not as extensive as it could be. NATO's work with the African Union revolves around three key activities: operational support, capacity building support, and help with the development of the African Standby Force. The Alliance now has a liaison office at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, and the recent changes in the AU's long-term objectives needs to be noted. Representatives from both organizations now meet annually to discuss areas for further cooperation. These are very welcome developments. We must keep up the momentum. The Alliance also works on African issues with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. UN-NATO cooperation on the continent was made clear in Libya in 2011 and through counter-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden in 2008. Although certain political factors complicate the UN-NATO relationship, relations should be further developed as much as possible. The Alliance, as an organization, does not dispose of the necessary instruments to address the underlying causes of radicalization, migration, criminality, and conflict. However, the European Union plays an important role in these areas in Africa. Its projects spurs economic development and promotes good governance, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Consequently, collaboration between NATO and the EU on the continent must be expanded. The need to pay close attention to the developments in Africa is understood by a number of the individual NATO allies. Many contribute troops to the UN and EU missions in Africa. Some provide training and support to African militaries and conduct counterterrorism, anti-piracy, and other operations across the continent. Their influence is being affected by the increasing role played by China and Russia in African security. It remains to be seen whether this proliferation of players can mean cooperation rather than competition. After all, every external actor should have an interest in stemming transnational terrorism, maritime piracy, and illicit trafficking. However, there is no certainty of this goal. Overall, while NATO resources are limited, there are some opportunities where the Alliance's engagement could make a positive impact on security in Africa. First and foremost, NATO must improve its awareness of the security developments there. This could be done by greater intelligence sharing and cooperation between allies, NATO partner countries, and other international organizations involved in African security issues. The hub in the south should obviously play an important role in this regard. The allies need to provide sufficient resources for its operation. The focus of the report, and the lion's share of the report in the African context, will be fully explored at our next meeting for opportunities for NATO's involvement on the continent. And before I conclude, on behalf of the rapporteur, I want to thank the research assistants and Nadia O'Shaughnessy and always Stefan Sachs for their invaluable assistance in putting this very complex report together. So I thank you on behalf of the rapporteur for your attention, and I will take the remarks and questions and certainly pass them on to our rapporteur. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I don't know about all of you, but I certainly learned a great deal from this draft report. I was aware of Yemen, I was aware of the Sahel, but there's no doubt that the interests of NATO in a continent which I think we have, if not ignored, at least rather taken for granted or thought was someone else's responsibility, are increasing, not least, of course, because of the movements of people and the causes of that. So in that, on that basis, I think this is a very substantial piece of work, and I congratulate everyone who's had the responsibility of dealing with it. Now,
Mr. Yildiz from Turkey.
I have Mr. Ahmed Yildiz from Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The rapporteur summarized very well the roots of radicalization in Africa and the means how allies can help. We will have a small addition to proposed addition. As you know that Sahel is very important, so is Somalia, which is source of many problems in the continent. As a part of comprehensive assistance package to Somalia, like full-fledged embassy, assistance projects, hospitals, schools. Since 2017, Turkey started educating, training Somali security forces to build up capacity to fight terror. It is an addition to EMISOM, which will be complementary. So we will table a small sentence to be added reflecting this. I will send it to reporter Kalha just for the information of this August body. Thank you.
The forest of people who wish to speak, so I'm just making sure I've got all the names right. Yes, Mr. Paolo Fiorentini, I beg your pardon, I do apologize. Mr. Paolo Fiorentini from Italy.
Thank you, Chairman. 3 comments. I have to stress, first of all, once again, the importance of the hub to the south. We hope our Mediterranean dialogue partners will join forces with us and provide the voluntary national contribution in terms of manning. This is fundamental to have an hub which is 100% operational. And let me express gratitude to the General Rapporteur because it is really well balanced and factual. And yes, I have only to stress the importance of the hub and to say it's essential, the dialogue with the African Union.
We'll take them in threes, if that suits. Mr. Shimkus of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For Julio, when we report back to him, paragraph 26 and on kind of talk about China and Russia. And so my question is, this great power competition that we see in resources in Africa, is it a threat? Is it something that NATO should be concerned with? It's raised, but I'm not sure it's fully vetted. So I don't know the answer to that. I just raised that for his and the Secretariat's review once we move to the fall.
Thank you for that. And from the United Kingdom, Mr. Tamanjeet Singh Desi, who, if I may say so, is attending the Assembly attending the Assembly for the first time as part of the British delegation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman, and an excellent report which you read with great eloquence and explaining in particular why it is crucial to have peace, development and progress within Africa. Indeed, it's in our own interest because it's the only way that we can enhance our own stability and progress while dealing with issues such as human trafficking or the refugee crisis or indeed migration into Europe and North America, because I think if we leave a void, on behalf of NATO, on behalf of Europe and North America, then I think the likes of China, Russia, and others will continue to build cordial relationships extract resources in exchange for building infrastructure and increase their sphere of influence and leave us far behind. But I wonder if you'd agree with me that the key themes for us in our relationship with Africa should be to treat Africa with respect, to treat Africa as an equal partner, and increase cooperation on defense, development, and intelligence sharing.
Thank you. Would you like to take these three?
I think I had 5. I'll certainly take all of the questions. Somalia, I note, I was ambassador to Somalia when Siad Barre left. So I've been very much involved with Somalia. Somalia's answers will lie within Somalia. And what we have to be is ever vigilant and ever ready to help in a positive way. Forgetting Somalia will not be the answer in the same way. In some ways, it's forgotten like Yemen is. So thank you for bringing Somalia back on the table. I'll relay that to Giulio when I talk to him. Certainly the support for Italy and the hub is very important. I think NATO has signaled that that is the way to go. We've got to make sure that it is operational and effective, and that the African Union takes it seriously, or not just another initiative that falls by the wayside, because they are gearing up to a new direction, which they've set for 50 years in principles, and just recently being there, they seem concerned about the issues we need to engage with them. The US beat me too, Giulio. The report is somewhat dated on the aspects of China and Russia and not fully explored. For example, I know that Russia has 19 military agreements in Africa. It's not noted here. China, we continue to think is economically there, but it is militarily there. It has its base in Djibouti, as it's put here. We need to pay more attention on the positives and the negatives of their influence, because they could go either way in wherever they are. Transnational crime is as much of a threat to Russia as it is to the rest of Europe. So I think there are some common causes, but a lot of nuances and new information that I think the report could be expanded on. I want to echo one comment from our new colleague from the UK. I think you've studied Africa as long as I have. Too long we have looked at Africa on a humanitarian basis and on an aid basis. I have spent, putting a plug for Canada, we have a Canada-Africa Association, and our whole goal was to talk about parliament to parliament so that they understand their role, because there's not much of a difference between executives and parliaments in many of the cases. But it is to develop foreign policy with each and every one of the 54 countries. We can look at the AU and we can look at how important it is and the new strategic regional concepts that they're developing. But it is important that we start to treat 1/4 of the UN as significant foreign policy actors, not just receivers of aid and our largesse when we can. So I think the key themes in Africa are yet to be explored, and increasingly sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region have more and more in common on the issues that they are facing. I think I mentioned Ebola. It is something that is spreading. We thought it would be spreading out of DRC. We're now seeing it's jumping countries because of migration patterns there. And it is moving in ways and could erupt at a minute's notice. So there's so much going on. And remember, it is the one place where there is population growth. There are more young people in Africa than elsewhere. And we need to be conscious of that. They are an opportunity for us in many of our countries, but they're also a difficulty that we should address within each and every one of the 54 countries. So I will be conveying all of this back to Giulio.
And finally, Mr. Folio from France.
Ah.
Thank you, Chair, Rapporteur, dear colleagues. I would like first and foremost to thank you, Madam Rapporteur, for the very high quality of this presentation of this report. In this report, we lay out the main challenges in terms of security for Africa and the alliance. However, I'd like to come back to one item in particular contained in this report. The Rapporteur indicated that the alliance is not necessarily called upon to act in Africa. In my view, and you will probably guess that I don't share this analysis. In my view, as I said, security in Europe hinges on the security in Africa. And I think that the alliance itself has a direct role to play there. Some allies tend to think that collective intervention in the region would be an adapted response. This is exactly what is ongoing at the time being, but it would be preferable to have an operation or intervention carried out by the alliance as a whole. France, of course, is particularly present and involved in the Sahel region with the very high cost in human lives that we are paying to ensure our collective security and defense. And when I talk about our security and defense, I do not only mean France's or Europe's defense, but the defense of our Euro-Atlantic area as a whole. France, as I said, is an historical partner in partnership with the G5 Sahel group, with the Barkhane operation, which was launched in August 2014 with over 400 troops in the Sahel region, with the objective to fight against the terrorist groups in this region and to support partner forces to make sure that there is a gradual return to a more stabilized situation in an area where militarized groups are almost prevailing over states. I think that this can only be done in a transborder manner with the EU, with the African Union, of course, with the UN, obviously, as well. And I would like to welcome the relentless support of some of our allies and partners, European ones, Spain, Germany, the UK, but also the US, in this fight against terrorism, which is a direct contribution to the security of the Euro-Atlantic area. So besides everything that we do on the eastern flank, on behalf of the alliance, I think that the alliance and NATO can also do much more in its southern flank. I think that it's important to pledge human and financial resources so as to undertake this mission in an effective manner. Thank you very much.
Certainly that is not the perspective within the report. It indicates, and to be fair to Giulio, I think that what he was saying is that we shouldn't undertake operational activities. I think this is a reaction to some of our out-of-area activity historically. But your point is well taken. We're a very interconnected world. Taking on what the U.S. has said about Russia and China, I think that it would be well served for NATO PA to relook at how we approach African security and how it is part of our security. So I will certainly be passing that on to Giulio to reflect and to think about that, and perhaps the report will be different and it can be dialogued in October. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Would you like to take a deep breath before we ask you to move on to the next
As long as I can get my notes, I'll
Right,
be fine.
well, we'll give you time for that.
No, I'm ready if you
But I'm just going to, an illustration of China's use of economics in order to further military objectives, of course, is the fact that the substantial sum of money was loaned to,
many countries.
Yes. It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, a substantial sum of money was owned When the country concerned could not afford to pay back the sum of money, then the Chinese accepted a naval base in Sri Lanka in return for for the money that was owed. That's a clear illustration of how economic power is easily transmissible into both political and military capability. Have you had long enough for the notes?
Yes,
Right,
I have.
thanks.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, the next item, ladies and gentlemen, is the consideration of the draft report of the Subcommittee on NATO Partnerships, NATO-Russia Relations, a snapshot, and that is presented by Renel in her own right. Renel.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to place my final report to the Political Committee today and to introduce the report NATO-Russia Relations, a snapshot, to the Political Committee. Russia and the NATO-Russia relationship appears to be a perennial issue for us at this time. So this draft report is an update of earlier Political Committee reports on this subject. And it is in fact natural to have the subcommittee on NATO partnerships focusing on Russia again. Russia plays a significant role in international security. Russia's approach to its neighbors, to Europe, and to NATO allies is important to Euro-Atlantic stability. To understand Russia's policies, we need to understand the factors shaping its foreign policy and security policies. What the paper in front of you attempts to do is to identify key areas where Russia's actions impact the security of NATO allies. It suggests that the Kremlin is pursuing a revisionist approach and wants to establish a different international order. The report notes that President Vladimir Putin shows no intention of changing and that Russia is likely to continue its confrontational attitude towards the alliance. The report argues that the best response to Russia's provocative actions for the alliance is to remain firm and continue strengthening its defense and deterrence capabilities without escalating the already tense relationship. To that end, NATO member states need to maintain their political cohesion in relationship with Russia and muster the necessary political will to counter Russian aggression when and where necessary. At the same time, the Allies could continue the political dialogue with Russia and evaluate possible avenues to expand and, if possible, deepen this dialogue. This is concluded in the report. The implicit point being necessary dialogue on a basis-to-basis attempt. Now, allow me to elaborate a bit on some parts of the draft report. I will not refer to the details in the brief introduction, but I would obviously be more than glad to discuss this with any of you if you wish to raise the issues. For most of us in the West, 2014 was the game changer in the NATO-Russia relationship and in the way we look at Russia. It's true that the earlier signs that the Russia of President Putin was pursuing an at least assertive policy towards NATO and NATO partner countries. The most obvious were the 2008 Russia-Georgia war and President Putin's earlier remarks at the Munich Security Conference. And perhaps a closer look at Russia's strategic documents, the military doctrine, the national security strategy, and the most recent foreign policy concept would have helped us. These documents outline Russia's foreign and security priorities and the instruments that it is willing to use to achieve these objectives. Under President Vladimir Putin, Russia has put a premium on restoring international recognition for its self-proclaimed status as a great power that can claim to be on par with the United States. Russia sees itself in perpetual conflict and competition for dominance and influence. For Moscow, the West, including the EU, is challenging both Russia's security and its great power ambition. Public statements by senior Russian officials reflect these views, as President Putin and others have repeatedly criticized the alliance for pursuing policies that ignore Russia's legitimate security interests. Relations with the West are primarily seen as a zero-sum game, and the Kremlin presumes that Western policies are primarily designed to weaken and encircle Russia. If NATO allies tend to have a broader, more comprehensive view of security, the Kremlin appears more fixated on territorial security. From the Kremlin's perspective, Russia needs a buffer zone of friendly or dependent states around it in order for it to be secure. This is essentially a view of the world seen through the lens of the 19th century great power politics. President Vladimir Putin regards military might as an indispensable prerequisite for asserting Russia's national interests successfully. Correspondingly, the role of the intelligence services and of the armed forces in the implementation of Russia's foreign policy has increased in the Putin presidency. Coercive diplomacy, including the threat of military force, has become an integral part of Russia's toolbox in dealing with other countries. This is most clearly visible in the countries of the former Soviet Union, and particularly in the case of Ukraine and Georgia. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was the first time that one country had taken a part of another by force in Europe since the end of the Second World War. The response of the Allies to Russia's aggressive actions has been firm. All practical cooperation with Russia was suspended by NATO in April 2014. NATO has also adapted by rebuilding its military capabilities and by streamlining its structures and processes, thus making the organization fitter and faster for decision-making. The decisions taken at the summit in Wales in 2014 and the summit in Warsaw in 2016, together with the European Deterrence Initiative of the United States, shifted NATO's posture back toward collective defense and deterrence. In this context, NATO allies have deployed combat-ready troops in the east of the alliance on a rotational basis and tripled the size of the NATO response force, amongst others. The European Defense Agency is leading efforts that will improve NATO's ability to deploy and sustain forces, as highlighted at the 2018 Brussels summit. Moreover, NATO members and the European Union have invoked several rounds of sanctions to make Russia comply with the international agreements to which it has committed. At the same time, NATO is keeping channels of political and military communication open to allow for exchange of information on issues of concern, to reduce misunderstandings, and to increase predictability. The draft report also lists key issues of NATO-Russian relationship. Moscow's aggressive behavior towards NATO member and partner states is obviously on top of our concerns. Russia's use of hybrid warfare and other techniques has grown considerably in recent years. Cyberspace has become a central tool for attempts of the Kremlin to undermine the cohesion of the alliance and destabilize democratic institutions in NATO member and partner states. This poses a serious challenge to Euro-Atlantic stability, security, and unity. Russia has targeted elections and referenda, according to Western intelligence agencies and other non-governmental organizations like Bellingcat, which were able to attribute cyber attacks to Russian military intelligence. Russian disinformation campaigns and cyber activities attempt to advance political groups and politicians perceived as amenable or friendly to Russian influence and discredit those as seen as hostile. The Kremlin uses every opportunity to discredit Western values and to undermine confidence in Western democracies and in the West as a whole. A long-standing point of contention in our relationship with Russia is the open door policy. NATO enlargement poses a major problem in the eyes of Russia. The principal foreign policy priority of the Kremlin is to check any further advance of NATO into what it considers its sphere of interest. Moscow is working actively against NATO's open door policy, even in regions which it does not consider to be part of the near abroad. However, as the report emphasizes, NATO enlargement is not directed at Russia. On the contrary, in this draft, I point out that the open door policy of the alliance has contributed to spreading democracy, security, and stability across Europe. NATO membership has never been imposed on any country. All member states have joined the alliance in accordance with their domestic democratic processes. It is a fundamental principle of international law that every nation has the right to determine its own security arrangements. Every country that joins NATO also commits to upholding the principles and policies of the alliance, which includes the commitment that, and I quote, "The alliance does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia," end of quote. Despite Russian pressure, the alliance continues the open door policy and the accession of North Macedonia once all parliamentary ratification processes have been completed, and this is proof of our open door policy. So the enlargement continues, and the alliance continues to provide support to applicant countries. NATO and the EU have repeatedly stressed their firm support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia, the Republic of Moldova, and Ukraine within their internationally recognized borders. Another important issue in the NATO-Russia relationship is the latter's increasing activity in the Middle East and the North African region, and I might add as well as other parts of Africa and the world. Moscow's intervention in the Syrian civil war not only kept the Assad regime in power, but, together with the support provided by Tehran, has also enabled Assad to regain control of most of the country. This does not bode well for Syria's immediate future, as the defeat of the opposition will limit Assad's incentives to compromise and deliver on long overdue reforms in that country. As governance is unlikely to change, the conditions in which violent terrorism thrives will continue to exist. Moreover, Russia is expanding its influence in Africa by pursuing every opportunity to reestablish relations with erstwhile partner countries of the former Soviet Union. Moscow does this through signing security agreements, arms sales, and providing military training. The Middle East and Africa play an important role for the security on NATO's southern flank. We should pay closer attention to Russia's activities in the region. The last issues that are relevant for the NATO-Russia relationship are terrorism and arms control. The fight against international terrorist groups was a key area for practical cooperation between NATO and Russia. Moscow is considerably concerned that radical Islamist groups could operate on its territory, particularly in its southern parts. This is one reason why Moscow has followed the developments in Afghanistan closely. It has become increasingly active diplomatically to reach a negotiated settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. There have been allegations, and they are allegations, that Russia shared intelligence with the Taliban and possibly also provided weapons to the insurgents. While these allegations are thus far unproven, Moscow's reaching out to the Taliban has given them a modicum of legitimacy and recognition, which could possibly embolden the group. On the other hand, if complementary to and coordinated with the US-backed Kabul process, Russia's current efforts could in fact help to find a solution that ends the conflict in Afghanistan. With regards to arms control, Moscow has continued to undermine its trustworthiness through its selective implementation of the Vienna document and the Treaty on Open Skies, as well as its long-standing non-implementation of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. With its aggression against Ukraine, Russia has also violated the Budapest Memorandum and the Helsinki Final Accord, which lay out the principles for relations among states in the Euro-Atlantic area. Most recently, Russia's violation of the Inf Treaty has led to the suspension of the treaty. Unless Russia honors its INF Treaty obligations through the verifiable destruction of all of its 9 M729 systems, the treaty will no longer be in effect. So where do we go from here? Russia is too big to ignore. It was and will remain a key factor with significant influence for Euro-Atlantic and indeed global security. The country plays a crucial role in international security, amongst others in tackling the nuclear challenges posed by North Korea and Iran. Moreover, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it has considerable leverage over the international security agenda. The report makes several concrete suggestions how NATO should deal with Russia. First and foremost, the draft suggests to continue the measures designated to strengthen defense and deterrence. The second recommendation is to maintain the economic pressure on Russia unless the Kremlin revokes its reckless policies. NATO allies and the EU should also consider expanding the existing sanctions regime if the Russian leadership continues to destabilize the democratic systems of the NATO member countries. At the same time, NATO should seek ways to encourage the Kremlin to change its approach. The most promising way forward for NATO is to continue its dual-track approach of maintaining a strong defense and deterrence, and complementing this with a periodic, focused, and meaningful dialogue. Moreover, NATO should evaluate additional avenues to improve the existing NATO-Russia dialogue, even if Russia's assertive propaganda makes dialogue extremely difficult. Finally, Russia's interaction with Western countries will be at least transactional, based on national interests when those happen to coincide or come sufficiently close. Despite Russia's antagonistic behavior, there are areas where the interests of NATO and Russia align and where both could attempt to create common ground. This includes counterterrorism, search and rescue in the Arctic, counter-piracy, and anti-narcotics in Afghanistan. It goes without saying that NATO's relationship with Russia must be based on the principles of the international rule of law. Let me therefore conclude by stressing that the Allies should encourage Russia to go back to these rules-based international order and treaties that it adhered to. Given the Kremlin's behavior in recent years, this will not be an easy task, but we should never give this goal up. Let me also emphasize that any possible rapprochement between the alliance and Russia must not come at the expense of any third country and NATO partners in particular. We look at Russia, and this is a personal note, through the eyes of its administration, but we should never forget the people in Russia and the difficulties they are facing. However, our responsibility is to our citizens and our security and our defense, and we must be vigilant and coherent and together in our goals. Thank you.
We'll take them in threes, if I may. Mr. Roger of France first, Mr. Formentini of Italy, and Madame Dubois of France after that. So Mr. Roger first.
Merci. Many thanks. I shall be brief, because I hope so, saying that obviously this report is extremely important to us. I feel that it will not be hard for us to approve the report, especially given that it does point out the requirement for dialogue and that we should take advantage of any common ground. I'd just like to give my own point of view from the French Senate, where I sit, because we do maintain in the Senate parliamentary dialogue with the Kremlin on a standing basis. We feel this is beneficial. Last March in 2018, in fact, we drafted together with our Russian counterparts an information report, which was a new initiative and a very strong symbol, politically speaking. Our main points of convergence and of divergence at the same time obviously are clear in this report. The report laid stress on these to show how far we can come together and re-establish confidence, which has been lost. It's true that if sometimes there are reasons for discord between our countries, it is still true that on a number of other topics, cooperation is possible and we can find common ground. I would like to quote those areas. I'm thinking of the fight against terrorism, on non-proliferation for weapons of mass destruction, and climate change, which are the main stakes at play where we can work together with Russia. Many thanks.
Inundated, overwhelmed with requests to speak. May I ask for brevity, if I possibly can? I've now got, I think, I've got 9 or 10 people, so that we can get everyone in. The more concise the questions, the better chance everyone will have to speak. Mr. Formentini of Italy.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. With reference to paragraphs 43, 53, and 62, just one remark. We know that the military-to-military level dialogue with Russia is still ongoing and proved to be effective so far to reduce risk and avoid escalation. We have to keep it alive and work all together to upgrade it with a meaningful political dialogue. Dialogue, as you all know, is part of the dual-track approach that the Allied heads of states and government approved.
Commendably brief. You get the chairman's prize. Madame Dubois.
Many thanks, Chairman, Madame Rapporteur. Colleagues, I'd like to warmly welcome the work of our Rapporteur, this very balanced report. What should guide our action, our philosophy, I feel, is that we adopt a balanced approach with a firm position for dialogue. Our rapporteur, despite the problems that we have with Russia, recognizes that we have common challenges where we can usefully cooperate, and we can cooperate. I'd like to react to another report put to our Assembly during the current Bratislava session, sanctions against Russia, economic sanctions primarily. Restoring sanctions is good idea, but for some years now, the sanctions have been in place but have more penalized our countries, our exporting countries, which export towards Russia. The sanctions have had a negative, reversible effect. Russia can now reject certain European products and has no choice, and has adapted to this by adapting its own sector by importing European experts to transform certain products internally and domestically. Even if we were to lift economic sanctions, exports towards Russia would no longer reach their level before the sanctions. I'm not forgetting here our eastern neighbours who have paid a heavy price economically, especially in the energy field. Why is this linked to the report of the Economic Committee? Why am I talking about this? Because the sanctions imposed are a political tool aimed at punishing Russia and it's changing its behaviour. To conclude, Madame la Rapporteur, I entirely agree with the basic lines of your report. You plead in favour of balanced relations with Russia and a firm position in dialogue. But I would call for a quality report of this nature to be presented also about Chinese expansionism at a forthcoming session. Many thanks.
I think most of these are comments that should be taken into account with the next rapporteur in the report as we change. I think the main comment I would make is that I hope it's a balanced report. Had I written my own, it would be obviously different. The challenge is to make sure that we have a cohesive approach from all our members. That way we're stronger. So cohesion to me is extremely important. And so therefore we did put dialogue in. But the single most important duty is the defense and security of our own citizens. And therefore dialogue should be where we believe it is in our best interest focused and will lead to some positive results for us. So a lot of this was about dialogue, and I take those comments and they'll be passed on. With respect to sanctions, I think it was best said to me, and I won't quote who said it, is if we so strongly believe in the values of the NATO Charter, then there is a price to pay, and it may be an economic price, because the alternative is even worse, both economically and to our values system. So yes, sanctions have a price, but I think it's one that I believe is necessary. I will put my comments on the table very strongly. I've worked on sanctions in South Africa and elsewhere, and the sanctions do have an effect, and a helpful effect, for the citizens within the country. It was Nelson Mandela that said, keep the sanctions even though they hurt us, because in the end we will be free. And so I think the same here. The price that is being paid, that's why I personally, and this is, I'll show my conflict of interest, I led the bill for the Magnitsky Sanctions, because it's targeted at those who are benefiting from the system in Russia, and that is not the average person in Russia. And so those are citizens who are profiting, but we are aiding and abetting them by allowing them to use our banks, our schools, our properties. So I come out, sanctions are in many ways a blunt tool, but they are a necessary tool if we want to maintain the values within the NATO partnership. And I, at this point, think that they are. But we should constantly evaluate how we use them, when we use them, and where we use them. So I would hope each and every report will address the issues of dialogue, sanctions, deterrence, and defense. And we cannot be complacent. I think we have to be ever vigilant. So that's a little bit of my swan song statement. I apologize for that. And I do think the last comment was very good, that we should look at China again, but China and Russia and how they are reordering the international order. I remember people saying, well, you're concerned about Crimea, it doesn't bother me in X and Y. And I say, yes, but what about the South China Seas? What about other disputes? So there is a different coalition forming in Venezuela and other places. And we should be mindful of those trends back to what our responsibility is our citizens and their defense and deterrence of any intrusions into our values and our countries.
Okay, thank you very much for that robust response.
Yes. Sorry.
You're allowed. You're allowed.
Just strongly.
You've got leave.
Thank you.
Mr. Domonsky of North Macedonia, followed by Mr. Askarov of Azerbaijan, and then Mr. Shitak of Romania. Mr. Domonsky.
Mr. Chair, my name is Vesel Mehmedi. I'm from North Macedonia, so I'm not from Azerbaijan. Okay, Mr. Chair, Madam Speaker, if I have to choose between justice and disorder on the one hand, and injustice and order on the other hand, I would always choose the latter. These are not my words, these are the words of the big Henry Kissinger. Now, my question relates to exactly what you said, and then we have Georgia of 2008, we have Ukraine of 2014, we have Salisbury, and we have many other incidents. So my question is, do you believe that what is going on with all these cases is because we prefer order and security in the world and not values and justice that was said by Henry Kissinger? I'm not trying to speak anymore about realpolitik and what his philosophy meant with détente, but you talked about that we have to pay a price for those values, and we are paying a price for not acting and not for acting with regard to sanctions. Thank you.
My apologies for the misidentification. With some trepidation then, I say. Mr. Askarov, Azerbaijan. Yeah.
Я буду говорить на русском.
I will speak Russian. I will speak Russian language. Dear Chairman, Madam Andreychuk, first of all, I would like to thank you for your presentation. Nevertheless, your presentation, or rather some elements of your presentation, cause a certain not understanding from my side. I would like to draw attention of the respectful audience and to the speaker to point 32 on the relations between NATO and Russia, the snapshot. Item 32, where the territorial integrity and borders are recognized for the countries which are friendly to Azerbaijan. At the same time, these principles of international law are not recognized with respect to Azerbaijan. I'd like to call upon our colleagues who are responsible for drafting this report to introduce relevant changes into the draft of this document. As an example, I can tell you about a number of documents, including a Brussels Declaration adopted in June last year, in which, once again, the clear support was expressed to territorial integrity and sovereignty of Azerbaijan Republic within internationally recognized borders. Thank you for your attention.
I'm Mr. Shitak of Romania.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Madam Rapporteur, for your professional works and substantial report you provided us. I was curious to count in the paper how many times it was mentioned the name Putin, Vladimir Putin or Mr. Putin, and the reason was 11 times, and the last 3 times was in each paragraph of preliminary conclusion. You know, when we are discussing about Russia, it is a temptation, it's not temptation, it's a reality to personify the Russia with Mr. Putin. But the question is the following: if starting tomorrow is no longer Putin, does Russia's policy change? This is my question. And according to my understanding, if you understand the way of decision are made in Russia, we'll see that no, nothing will change or very little, and no matter what at most. Because there are different layers in decision taking in Russia. In Russia, decisions are made at lower levels. After that, decisions are the subject to a process of analysis and refining at the interdepartmental or interministerial level, and after which the decision reached to Mr. Putin, who communicates decision. It is very true that Mr. Putin is a strategic thinker and supreme arbiter of different group of interest in Russia. This is my intervention, is by way of thinking about how is made a decision in Russia, and it's up to you if you think it deserves to introduce in the report or not. Thank you.
Respond to these.
I think the issue of order and values and justice is a constant. We lived through some years ago, no peace without justice, no justice without peace. The same thing, is it our values we sacrifice for order and stability, or is there some balance? I think that's what democratic countries struggle with, and it is very often the fact situation that will drive the compromises. There is no perfect answer, and we have to continually struggle as to whether we have the right balance. I don't think we sacrifice one or the other. I think at any given moment, society, our citizens, our leaders have to make those choices, and that's why we have a NATO together, that we struggle with what does it mean, deterrence, what does it mean defense. I remember all the discussions, do we only stay within our borders or do we go to the near abroad? And then of course 9/11 occurred, and all of a sudden it's a discussion about North America. Do you expand there? I hope we constantly struggle, because I'm not sure where the balance is. I go to sleep wondering whether we're doing the right thing. That's having a conscience about what you think is right, given the, and the information you get, because it's very much based on what you know, and tomorrow you may know more, and the factors change. So we have to be ever vigilant. That's all I can answer on that. With Mr. Kissinger, I could have a nice debate about many conversations I've had there, and they were ongoing. I thank the Azerbaijani delegation that brought the attention of paragraph 32 to my attention earlier, so to forewarn me, which I was grateful for. The report is about Russia and NATO, and so that directly goes to the incursions of 2008, 2014, etc., and Moldova. These are countries that are aspiring to come into, or at least they've indicated they want to come into NATO. I get the point that there are territorial disputes, and perhaps we should point that out somewhere, but that was not the focus of this report. I will pass on, however, that you feel that they should not be neglected or frozen, I guess is the term. So that will be passed on. You're right about our Romanian colleagues saying that we keep saying Putin, Putin. I do understand the history of Russia. It didn't start and it won't end with Putin. But in writing a report, who is ultimately in charge of that country? Who speaks for that country? It's President Putin, and that's why he's referred to. It by no means infers that he's gone and everything will change or everything will stay the same. So it's really the art form that you use in delivering the report, but your point is well taken, that we shouldn't be lulled into one person being the issue.
Okay, and Boris Rezhnevsky of Canada, followed by Mr. Yildiz of Turkey, and followed by Mr. Shimkus of the United States. Boris.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Raynell, for an excellent report. In this report and in many of the presentations, often the military invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea is referenced. However, we seem to have not fully taken stock of another Russian territorial expansion that's taken place, and that's in the Sea of Azov. It may not be land territory, but it is a militarily based expansion which has diminished the sovereignty of Ukraine. And it also has implications, as you talked about in this particular report, an international system of treaties, post-World War II treaties that has created an international system of rule of law. In this particular case, the law of the Sea Convention was breached in their military naval attack against Ukrainian ships. Their abduction of Ukrainian sailors and continued incarceration, abduction of sailors off their vessels into Russian territory, and continued incarceration breaches the Geneva Conventions. And I believe that we should be cognizant that Russia continues this conduct of territorial expansions in different ways at times. So I think that's an important point to note, because this is recent, and because it's an ongoing situation, those sailors continue to be mistreated and incarcerated. It raised the whole question of how do we react, which goes to your point on sanctions. And how do we sanction? Well, targeted sanctions. Russia has de facto created an embargo of the very important industrial ports of Mariupol and Berdyansk, with tremendous economic consequences for Ukraine and that region. Should we not be looking at targeted economic sanctions on Rostov-on-Don and Novorossiysk? Thank you.
Mr. Yildiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate the rapporteur for the quality of the report. On the Syrian part, as everybody knows, Turkey is heavily involved both in the negotiation processes, Geneva, Astana, and the operations in the field within Syria. I submitted the rapporteur some simple amendments on the wording just to make it more in line, more compatible with the language used by friends of Syria in the negotiations. Now it is at her or her successor's discretion. Secondly, use of word Islamic when describing the extremist groups, militant groups, or jihadists, in my opinion, is still counter-firing, or it may serve the purposes of, on one side, to the extremists, on the other side, to the Islamophobic circles. We should try until the autumn to find a better wording or to put a footnote if we couldn't agree on a better language. Thirdly, I will be happy to if the rapporteurs can address the Azerbaijani concerns, because this conflict also is of same character with other frozen conflicts mentioned in the reports, not just in this report, but in other NATO reports. Thank you.
John Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here together because we believe in democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. I appreciate the report. Putin is a dictator, so I appreciate the naming out of the leader of the Russian Federation. Why I so much appreciate my Eastern European, former captive nations, colleagues and friends is because they lived under that. KGB, torture chambers, movement of mass people to Siberia. We're politicians, so we know how to delay things by talking, right? If there's a piece of legislation people ask us to get involved with and we don't like it, we'll just talk it to death. And then a new Congress or a new session will come in. So for the report, and I appreciate my colleagues who say they're in dialogue, if you could point one positive aspect of the Russian Federation over the past 5 years, we should probably include that in the report, because I know of none. That dialogue has helped over the past 5 years. So my request would be is if there's anything you know that has happened positively by dialogue, we should include it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Beg your pardon. You can answer these three.
All right. I'll answer my colleague from Canada, Boris. We couldn't possibly put everything in the report, and I think if you read the report, you understand the most egregious was entering another country, Crimea. But the outflow of that is everything that you talked about. So perhaps we can use some language that encompasses the ongoing consequences of that attitude. Sure. We didn't even talk about the Tartars, the human rights. I mean, there's so much. So it may be a shorthand to say these were the intrusions, but we're aware that it's going on. And unfortunately, the reports have to be written, translated in, so they're always behind the time, but I think we can use sort of language that encompasses the consequences that are continuing to flow from the Crimea situation. Our Turkish colleague mentions the definition of Islamic. I thought we had already corrected it. It appears we're still struggling with that. Your comments are noted about that. The comment, again, as I say, we were addressing where there's been direct intervention by Russia into Ukraine, into Georgia. But there are these other, and Russia plays an influence in there. That could be a footnote or it could be a paragraph. We'll pass that on to the rapporteur. Mr. Shimkus, thank you for stating what we stand for as NATO. That is why through the report, dialogue should never be forgotten. And just to be a little, I'm looking at Boris Tarasuk here, I thought it was the diplomats that could delay, talk, put off. You're right, politicians are as guilty of that too. But I think sometimes delay by talking is good, in the same way that keeping the dialogue open is good. It is not open for the purpose of saying we're yielding. We're saying if something is critical to us, we will dialogue, not because somebody else wants to dialogue to frustrate our capability or to restate it in a way. We know that sometimes they'll say, well, I've been through those negotiations personally where they say, we will come to the negotiating table, but next week. You get to the negotiating table next week, nothing's happening. So I think it's a fine balance, and you're right. There are some positives with Russia, but they are small positives in certain situations. One in Syria, as you know, where the Americans were all in the air at the same time with the Russians. There was dialogue there, very necessary for both sides. It worked. But surely the entire relationship doesn't rest on that one dialogue. So I think if you read the report, I'm hoping the message came through that it has to be focused in our interest to have that dialogue, not simply dialogue for dialogue's sake. So I think those were all the comments, and I thank them, and I hope I can translate them all with Stefan's help to the new rapporteur.
Well, I'm afraid we're not quite finished yet.
I'm joking.
Yeah. Mr. Kandelakis of Georgia, and then Oja Kalnins of Latvia.
Thank you, President. Ronald Reagan had a great phrase for...
Excuse me a moment. I'll come back to a question in relation to Armenia, but I want to ask you a question first before I invite you to speak.
May I?
Yeah. Can you do it?
Thank you.
Oh. No.
Thank you. Ronald Reagan had a great phrase on how to conduct dialogue with the Russia, Soviet Union.
I'm sorry, we can't I've got a list. I asked for brevity. We're approaching the time when you're entitled to a coffee break. I don't want to find the I beg your pardon. I misunderstood. I thought you were someone else. I apologize for that. You're from Georgia. You're entitled to speak because I called you. I beg your pardon. Go
on. Ronald Reagan had a great phrase on how to conduct dialogue with Russia and Soviet Union, and that was trust but verify. Доверяй, но проверяй. Just very quick bullet points. Two concrete ideas. One idea I put forth earlier today, and Congressman Connolly's report on sanctions, he very much endorsed it, and perhaps it is high time for our Assembly to make a call for members and partners to adopt Magnitsky legislation. These type of personalized sanctions are less costly than the big sanctions. The big sanctions is a separate debate, but these sanctions really hurt. So we could perhaps all think of a form in which we could make this call and this voice will be heard. It's unfair that only few countries bear this burden of adopting Magnitsky sanctions. Of course, before Ukraine there was Georgia, and it was, and perhaps it's high time also, may I put forth another concrete idea to perhaps recall the 2008 ceasefire agreement, the EU-brokered ceasefire agreement that was signed between Georgia and Russia, on par with the Minsk process and the obligations that Russia has. President Sarkozy obviously signed this agreement on behalf of the European Union. A similar proposal has been put forth by David McAllister, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, for the EU to conduct the review of the implementation of this agreement, so that it's not just a talking point at a conference, but rather somehow gets integrated into an actual diplomatic agenda. And perhaps our Assembly could also think, because we adopt resolutions in the fall, how to recall this important agreement and integrate it, or make a call to integrate the call to implement the agreement and concern on its non-implementation into bilateral agenda of member states, and indeed NATO itself with Russia. When we speak about Russian MPs, I would caution our distinguished and respected colleagues to use this term, Member of Parliament, with a little bit of caution. Because Member of Parliament means that a person is a member of a legislature as a result of some kind of elections that have been that are more or less free, at least. And if you look at election observation reports of the Russian elections, they are neither free nor fair. So it is a little bit problematic to call Russian MPs actual MPs. And perhaps also, if I could put forth, and I'll end with that, third idea, and other assemblies do this, maybe we could think to invite Russian opposition representatives who are unfortunately not formally MPs, but are politically active. And I think our discussion would be more informed if we would invite some of them to present their worldview, their thinking of how Russia should look like in the future, and indeed what do they think about these sanctions and whether the sanctions impact these problems that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Once again, my apologies for misunderstanding. Yes, I said I would hear the Armenian, but I wish to know from the leader of the Armenian delegation if what is proposed is to reopen the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh. If that is the case, then I'm afraid you will not find me sympathetic for reasons which were discussed at the outset of the committee meeting. Perhaps you'd be good enough to tell me what your submission is.
Chairman, thank you. I'm sticking to the agenda, and I would like to support Madame Andreychuk's idea that that this report is about Russia and is about NATO, and any change could harm other conflicts which are very fragile. So I suggest the 32nd paragraph should remain as it is. Thank you.
I'm most grateful for your cooperation. And finally, Ojar Kalnins from Latvia.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Reynal for her service and again, another outstanding report. My brief remarks are really addressed to the new members of NATO Parliamentary Assembly who were not here prior to 2014. They may not know that we once had a Russian delegation that used to participate. In 2014, in the Standing Committee in Riga, we removed that delegation in light of the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. I think that was the correct decision. I think it still is a correct decision. We've talked a lot about dialogue. I totally agree, but a dialogue can take place in appropriate places. Anyone who was here prior to 2014 who remembers the Russian delegation's participation, I wouldn't call that a dialogue. I was a rapporteur once on a resolution concerning Russia, and I think I got 17 amendments from the Russian delegation. We had to debate each of those amendments. You could imagine what that was like. So this was not a dialogue. Again, I'm more than happy to have Russian representation here, but I think only after the issues in Crimea and Donbass have been resolved. And I just want to remind people, I think 13,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 5 years since this invasion of Ukraine. And I think we can resume a dialogue once the killing stops. Thank you.
I'm just going to say to Mr. Collins, I'm going to leave the historical record of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in your hands, because we have gone through many chapters with Russia, and unfortunately we find ourselves in one of the more negative times now. So I think we have to continue to address it. I don't think we have the definitive answer. We don't know where the world's going. And I think it was something that one of our speakers said this morning is, we're just not equipped for the future, because the future is so unknowable, if I can use that term. I mean, who would have been talking cyberspace 10 years ago? We should have been, because it was already there, but we were caught up with the current events. So your admonition about the past leads me to say for the future that I think the comments and the interest you've had make me feel very good to be leaving this assembly in such good hands, that you're all very engaged from your varying perspectives. If we all said the same thing all the time, I don't think we would be democratic. So we all have different perspectives, different constituencies, and I feel very grateful. And I want to thank the staff for all the work they've done on this report, but I particularly want to thank Stefan Sachs. I've been here for almost 20 years. He was there. He was just a young kid that came in, and he's been one of the most professional, engaged people that I've ever worked with. He deserves it. He takes every opportunity to dialogue about these issues. Many times I receive reports that are written by researchers and analysts, and then we either accept them or change them. But we get engaged, and I've had the most wonderful conversations with Stefan, and I think he's served this political committee especially very well. He knows you better than you know yourselves. He knows the nuances, and I think that Stefan deserves any accolades that any rapporteur ever gets here. So thank you for all your years.
Well, now, you can have a coffee break, but it has to be 15 minutes. Can I just say that I was present on the occasion 2014 that's just been referred to, and I have to tell you that the account of the Russian behavior was more of a diatribe than a dialogue. In fact, there was exploitation of opportunity, and among other reasons, when it came to the issue of the annexation of the Crimea and the meddling in Ukraine, the Standing Committee was of the view that the arrangements with Russia should be withdrawn. Would like to say something too.
Yes, I also asked for the short words. This time I prefer more to speak about Raynel than Russia. And saying thank you so much. You was my teacher, the best teacher ever, and thank you, good luck for you, Stefan, as well. But on Russia, just one sentence. I would like to ask my colleagues, when you will discuss later and make decisions, don't be afraid to contain Russia. It is not so strong as it appears. And NATO did that with Soviet Union, and we became free. So we have to do the same, and many other countries and people will feel free, including Russian people themselves. Thank you.
Right. Time for coffee, but one thing is to be said, that the debate on the final version of this report is going to be pretty hot. Tickets will be sold. can bring an end to that. Take your seats, please. Please take your seats. Please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. If I had my way, they wouldn't be allowed coffee, because coffee's a very bad thing.
On the one hand.
Exactly. Very well, ladies and gentlemen, we come to item 8, which is a presentation by Brigadier General Walter Feichtinger, who's the Director of the Institute for Peace Support and Conflict Management at the National Defense Academy in Austria. And the theme of his address is in relation to Ukraine under pressure and the implications for regional and transatlantic security as a result of that. Once again, may I remind you that the full curriculum vitae of all of our speakers is to be found on the website, but I can say of Brigadier General that he's much sought after lecturer and a prolific writer, been advisor for security and defense policy to the Austrian Federal Chancellery, among many positions in an extremely distinguished career. He has his own video blog on security issues, and you may find it helpful to tune in from time to time. We're very grateful to him, and indeed we're much obliged that we have the opportunity of hearing from him on this obviously relevant subject to our discussions. Brigadier General, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to give some personal views on a situation that we are witnessing in our east, seen from Austria. And the title of my presentation is Ukraine under Pressure, Implications for Regional and Transatlantic Security. You are aware that you have two anniversaries this year. 5 years annexation of Crimea and 25 years the accession of Ukraine to NATO Partnership for Peace. What has changed during that time? To say it in a nutshell, we shifted from optimism to pessimism, some say pragmatism, and we also had a shift from trust to distrust. That is what we are witnessing today and what is shaping our environment and our decisions. I have prepared a few points in order to talk about that. A few moments on the current situation in Ukraine, some geopolitical consequences or impact of the development during the last 5 years, and some considerations about future scenarios, what can be on in the future. Let me start with the first one. We are talking about a region, and I'm well aware that Canada and the United States are most important members of NATO, but that is not in the main focus of my presentation. Here you see the map with the different colors everywhere. Every one of you knows what it means. NATO and Georgia and Ukraine is interested in becoming NATO members, but having serious problems by the behavior of Russia in that context. What is the current situation? We have two ongoing conflicts in Ukraine. The first one in Crimea and the second one in the eastern part, in parts of the so-called Donetsk region. From my understanding, there are two different conflicts and two different political games, especially from the Russian side. The Crimean issue, for me, is more a military issue, because Russia would never accept that Crimea could become part of Ukraine and becoming Ukraine part of NATO. So it was, from my understanding, a preemptive action in that regard in order to have a safe and secure positioning of their Black Sea Fleet on the Crimean Peninsula in the future also. And the situation nowadays is different to the situation in the Donetsk and Luhansk region. What was the political aim and purpose of that engagement in supporting the separatist forces? In order to avoid the succession, the accession to EU and NATO. And we know it from previous conflicts and so-called frozen conflicts that it is a means that works. If you have a conflict, a hot conflict in a country, neither EU nor NATO will be able to include this country as a full member. So if you are able to have a hot conflict, to install and to promote a hot conflict in a country, you are the one who decides whether this country can be a member of the western part of the world or not. And that is my understanding of the two different conflicts. Not becoming a part of the Western Union in the Donbass and a military need in the Crimean Peninsula. What is the situation in the Crimean Peninsula nowadays? When you are talking to Russian representatives, they do not even want to talk about the topic. It is not a topic for them. It is the new reality. Some say it is the old reality. If you talk to representatives from the Ukrainian side, they also see it already a little bit different. And I got the understanding during my last visit in Ukraine that they tried to differ between the two conflicts in order to have two different solutions maybe in the future in dealing with that conflicts. We see on the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine some kind of normalizations. People from Ukraine can travel to the Crimean Peninsula. It is forbidden to go to Russia via Crimean Peninsula, but to come to Crimea is not such a problem at the moment. Totally different to the region in the east, in the Donbass. So behind the scene, I can imagine that some considerations are already on the way to find a way out of that. Maybe a political solution, maybe regarding with constitutional aspects as has been valid in the 2050s, the 1950s, excuse me, and no similar attempt to the situation in the Donbass. What we see there is still strong fighting, heavily shooting, many people affected in that region, and constant shelling and trench warfare in Donbass. The responsibility on the Ukrainian side was handed over to the military. Now we have a military operation in Ukraine, in the Donbass, and more than 30,000 soldiers are engaged on both sides, on the Ukrainian side and in the Donbass region. I'm sure you have already heard about the easier access to Russian passports for the people in that separated areas. Russians say that it is a means for humanitarian aspects to support the people because they can gain easier access to humanitarian needs. From a Ukrainian perspective, it is an intervention in domestic affairs. That is understandable, and we cannot expect that it will change in the foreseeable future. The positions of both sides are very hard, and they will not change during the next period. But what is also in place is a total new situation in Ukraine. A new leader in place, a new king in town. When you ask about the political program, the intentions and the aims, especially regarding the relationship with Russia, you get the answer that my program is an experiment. I give you, the population, the people of Ukraine, the frame, and you provide the content. Maybe you have heard on Thursday, Friday this week, the foreign minister of France and of Germany had their first visit to the new elected president in order to get a clearer picture of that frame and content of the new Ukrainian political picture of the future. International crisis management, it is done what can be done. OSCE is still having a special monitoring mission with about 750 international monitors in place. They can monitor during day, not during night. They still have problems to go to certain areas, especially in the Donbas region, and so on and so forth. Can a United Nations mission be expected in the foreseeable future? From my understanding, not, because the position of the Russian side and the Ukrainian side are too different in order to achieve a consensus on a UN mission. So this kind of mission of the OSCE is the reality. That is what can be done, and it will prevail in the future in that. What does it mean? No conflict resolution in this regard. The Minsk agreement is still in place, but both sides, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, have different priorities, and I do not see a way in the next month or even years to have a changed approach to that possibilities. Let me go a little bit out of the country. Geopolitical consequences. It was already mentioned in the presentation before regarding Russia influencing the Balkans. Since 2014, it is clear to everyone that Russia tries to prevent the countries in the region to become a full member of NATO or EU. It was not very successful till now, and North Macedonia is an excellent example for a failure of the Russian approach in this way. What we see is a closer cooperation in that region, but we always have to be aware that Russia is strongly against it. It is supportive to the leader of the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, for example, and so on. And what NATO can do and EU can do in this context is to keep track. To keep track in order to make the countries right prepared for the accession to the different organizations and not to get rid of the problems and to get rid of the problems that are still in place. That does not mean integration to all price. It means integration to the extent and the possibilities that are written down and that are declared by the different actors. Another point, and I was listening to you, the representative of Turkey, I see also a strong impact on the triangle between Russia, Turkey, and NATO. Because we know that Turkey is in a close cooperation with Russia because of Syria. But it is not only because of Syria, because the interest of Turkey is to have a close cooperation in Syria. But the interest of Russia, from my understanding, is a different one. It's not limited to Syria, it is also focused on NATO. And to have a strong Turkey, who was the key opponent in the Black Sea region of Russia in the former Soviet Union, is a key, is a milestone in the Russian foreign policy. And if it is possible to have a closer cooperation with Turkey and to undermine to a certain extent the cohesion within NATO in the internal relationship, Turkey and the NATO, I would say that is not to the benefit of both, neither of Turkey and neither of NATO. So I would say NATO should have a focus on that internal cohesion with Turkey. What you see is a new anti-air defense system that is procured by Turkey and that is nowadays in delivery. The first training has already started, and it can have a huge impact on the air defense systems in the region and the cooperation and collaboration within NATO in this regard. Another point is Crimea and the exclusive economic zone. Russia claims the full rights of having the authority and the sovereignty over Crimea, and that includes to have also the rights and the claims for the exclusive economic zone. When you have in mind that there are many gas and oil fields explored or not explored today, it has a strong economic impact on Ukraine, less on Russia, but more on Ukraine. Ukraine could need these oil fields and gas fields for the future development in economic terms, and if it is not provided, it is not available, it is not possible to explore that, it has a huge damage in that economic sense. Another point, and that is related to that, is the access to the Sea of Azov. Azov is very important for the Ukraine because the steel industry and the exports of steel industry during the Kerch Strait are of highest importance to Ukraine. Since in 2018, the bridge of Kerch was built, Russia has the total control of the ingoing and outgoing shipping to the Azov Sea. So it can exert a huge pressure on Ukraine, also in economic terms in that. And related to that, when Russia is controlling that area, it is very hard for Ukraine to build up its navy because 80% of its naval capacities were destroyed in 2014. So it has to build up, and with the support of the United States, it is ongoing. But doing so, having the Kerch Strait under your control, it is very easy. It is very easy to control for Russia and very hard to gain an effort in this regard from Ukrainian side. A third point in that context, having Crimea, is the military aspect of Russian deployments to Crimea. Maybe you remember before 2014, there were limitations in number, figures, and quality of the military deployment to Crimea Peninsula. After the annexation, from Russian side, it is totally ignored. It is Russian territory, so there cannot be any limitations to the Russian military deployment in that region. And it is changing the military balance of power in the Black Sea, from my understanding, because Russia has a stronger saying there. Russia has the capacity and the ability to do power projection into the Near East, into the Mediterranean Sea, faster and easier than it was able to do before. NATO's answer, we have already heard that different enhanced forward presence, a tailored forward presence, different headquarters, and so on, and newly the 430s, as it is called. That means armored brigades and Air Force units and Marine units, and deployable within 30 days in order to be able to answer rapid and fast and distinctively in a situation like it was in 2014. Not to forget the northern part. Look at Finland and Sweden. I think it is a very important point. I say it as an Austrian because in 1995, when Sweden, Finland, and Austria joined EU, we were comparable in the neutrality. Today it has totally changed. Austria still is a neutral country, but Sweden and Finland try to cooperate as close as possible, sharp before becoming a full member with NATO. And that makes a total difference to me, and that happened after 2014. A different threat assessment to nowadays. We also could see a strengthened relationship within NATO. I would say the cohesion has increased. We saw a big exercise, the biggest after the end of the Cold War in autumn last year. We see an increasing defense spending, not to the extent that the United States want, 2%, but it is increasing, and it is constantly increasing, and that is also a change due to the effects in 2014. What happened within the direct cooperation between NATO and Ukraine? Today, approximately 20 different programs are in place in order to support security sector reform in Ukraine from the NATO side. Milestones, as mentioned, 1994 Partnership for Peace. Current support is a comprehensive assistance package. And in 2017, the Parliament had a strong saying because the accession to NATO was a clear strategic goal decided by the Parliament. So Ukraine knows that it cannot become a full member of NATO within the next 5 years or 10 years. But it is a clear strategic goal to become a full NATO member in the future. So what is coming next? Nobody knows. And I say it as an Austrian. We didn't expect the developments in Austria we had during the last 2 weeks. So surprise is a strong element. Unpredictability is a strong element. Uncountability is a strong element. Hope, I hope it is a strong element, but really nobody knows what will come up in the next future. So we can draw 3 different scenarios, very blunt, very simple. The first one is a status quo situation. A status quo means Ukraine insists on territorial integrity, so no move between in the bilateral relations and negotiations maybe. Russia continues its support of separatists, so nothing changed. Crimea is the new old factor and normal. And what can NATO do in this context? Support the modernization of the Ukraine armed forces and political reforms. I think that is the most important thing, because the reforms in general in Ukraine are on the way, but they have not finished, and they are not at the end. And a strong alliance like the NATO has a strong impact and can have a strong impact on a new partner like Ukraine in order to support and to convince sometimes not to bypass reforms that are necessary and on the table. The second one is appeasement. One of the first comments of the new elected president was, I tried to come in negotiations with the Russian president. Right. What does it mean? Maybe the time is ripe for that. Maybe he has a different approach. Maybe he is convincing him with a new program on TV or something like that. Nobody knows. But he is new in town, he is new in his office, and he is new in an approach. I see it very optimistic in that context. Maybe he has new answers and new options. In that case, one can imagine that Russia would cease its support for the separatists. One could find a solution also for the Crimean Peninsula in a different way, separated from the Donbass. And a strong role for NATO could be to provide security guarantees for Ukraine, to give them a strong role in direct and bilateral negotiations. Confrontation, everyone says we do not want a confrontation. A military solution for the Donbass is out of reach. It cannot be achieved neither by the Ukrainian side nor by the separatist side. Everyone knows that if Ukraine would try to gain in, to reconquer the Donbass region, it would have a strong answer from the Russian side, as we have already seen in 2015, when it was about the small city of Debaltsevo. So Russia, in that context, would intensify its support of the separatists, close the Strait of Kerch, having a strong negative impact on the economy of Ukraine. Ukraine sets political and economic measures, for example, sanctions, passports, but it is an escalation of a conflict that tends to be frozen now to a certain level. From the NATO side, similar options like before, give support to Ukraine, not direct militarily. NATO can also not really support directly militarily in the Black Sea region. There's a strong international law and regulations that only very limited presence from non-neighboring countries of the Black Sea region are allowed to come from the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea region. And if there is one naval ship, for example, it is limited to its size and to the duration of the stay. It can stay only for 21 days due to international law and regulations for the Black Sea region. So military support in that context cannot be expected from NATO side. So that is what is coming up. Nobody knows. Let us wait and see, and let us be optimistic. Thank you for your attention.
Before I pass the matter over to my colleagues, I'm left in a quite deep sense of pessimism about this. Am I right, or do you think there is genuine possibility of some kind of settlement?
I'm not pessimistic in general. In that context, I'm more realistic and pragmatic, I would say. So we have to have a clear assessment of the different situation on Crimea, for example, and the different situation in the Donbass, and to have different political attempts in order to come to a resolution, or not a resolution in the first step, to have new ways, new ideas, in order to have the first step in that right direction.
Well, I mean, it looks to me like a log jam. How do we break the log jam?
I think we have to think in decades, not in years. We have to think in decades. 5 years are gone after the events in Crimea and Donbass. 5 years is nothing in that context. What has changed? What has really changed? And what are the international attempts in order to have a political resolution in that context? It's very limited. It could be more. It could be more after the Syrian conflict is settled to a certain extent, because I see it in a close content. Yeah? The development in Syria and the strong Russian engagement, and the engagement in the Ukrainian area. And when we come to a next phase in Syria, and that will happen during the end of that year, after Idlib, after the fights over Idlib, I think we have a new situation in Syria where the international community can and should come in, because we are talking about reconstruction of the country. And Russia cannot do that reconstruction. Russia needs partners for that. And so I can imagine in a bigger strategic frame that we have different contexts, different options, and to see it as a bigger game and not only related to Ukraine and Russia.
But I don't want to monopolize this, but Russia might well need partners for reconstruction of Syria, but it's not going to give up its influence over Assad, is it? So it would be a kind of it could be a lose-lose from those who provide assistance in reconstruction.
Yeah, you can see it as a lose-lose situation. For whom? For the Europeans, for the West?
Yeah.
Okay. I wouldn't see it as pessimistic as you do. I would say, okay, who has the money, who says what has to happen? So if you have a huge impact in that monetary and reconstructional aspects, I would say the situation of the Europeans would be stronger than it is nowadays.
Right. Okay, well, I hope that my pessimism, can I be optimistic that my pessimism may be unfounded? Boris Wisniewski from Canada.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for an excellent report that I think for many members here provided clarity. But I see this repeat over and over. I take some issue with the phraseology and terminology that was used in a couple places during the report on the map when you showed the Donbass and you labeled that area in the east as pro-Russian rebels. And then later in the report, you use the terminology support for separatists. And it speaks to the incredible effectiveness of Russian disinformation and the massive amounts of disinformation that we inadvertently take on some of the phraseology that they provide in describing that situation. It's in fact an artificially created conflict which without Russian leadership, military support, economic support, those puppet fake statelets would collapse and cease to exist. So perhaps we could think of terminology that would better reflect the reality of the situation, even something like support for separatists. Anytime they have installed someone into these so-called republics of Donetsk and Luhansk who's had a deviation from Kremlin instructions, those people are eliminated, new people are put in place. So it's not even support for separate, it's they fulfill the blueprint and the plans of the Kremlin. An excellent report, but perhaps we should put our minds to using terminology that better reflects Russia's modus operandi in the Donbass. Thank you.
We'll take the questions in threes, if we may. Boris Tarasuk of the Ukraine.
Thank you. Very interesting analysis, though in some parts very doubtful. And I will continue what Boris from Canada said about the terminology. You used the term rebels, speaking about Donbass, Ukrainian Donbass. I can assume that you took it from Al Jazeera, which is not always a very trustworthy source. But I cannot understand your terminology as to so-called Crimean Territorial Sea. There is no such country as Crimea. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. So the terminology should reflect at least the legal nature. So it is inadmissible for a serious analyst to use such a terminology as Crimean Territorial Sea. It doesn't exist. There is Ukrainian Territorial Sea, which Russians deny. But it doesn't mean that we have to accept these Russian terminologies. You said about some scenarios, 3 scenarios. One of them is status quo, first one. So, and you referred to some political reforms to be, NATO expects from Ukraine political reform. What kind of political reforms NATO expects from Ukraine? I am not aware of. I am aware of some other reforms like judiciary, reform of legal system, of security sector, but I am not aware of NATO talking, well, ever about political reforms in Ukraine. What do you mean, political reforms? I think that this is a mistake. You refer to second and third scenario about some security guarantees. What kind of security guarantees you are talking about? I am not aware of. There is only Article 5 of Washington Treaty, which speaks about, well, guarantees. There is Budapest Memorandum of National Security Assurances I am aware of, and I was a co-author of this document. So would you clarify, what do you think about, what do you mean referring in your scenarios 2 and 3 about security guarantees? And the best security guarantees for Ukraine I'm aware of is Article 5 of Washington Treaty, which is not feasible now. And the second, which is now being discussed in US Congress, this is the provision by the United States of major non-NATO ally given to Ukraine. So this is one of the guarantees. Thank you. I would be grateful for listening to your answers.
And Mr. Klus of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Dr. Feitinger, for your excellent report and analysis. I have a very simple question, if you don't mind. You spoke about the military balance of power, which has radically changed at the Black Sea after the annexation of Crimea. Could you please tell us what should be, from your point of view or Austrian point of view, appropriate answer of NATO in this case? Thank you.
Three quite stimulating questions.
As I'm the last speaker, I have to be provocative. So it worked, I would say, to a certain extent. Let me start with the first one on terminology. You're totally right. Yeah, and we have endless discussions in our institute, what is the right term for that. And we always have the problem that from the one party side, it is totally understandable, and from the other side, it is not at all acceptable. So we really worked hard on that to find the exact terminology. Syria, in that case, is even more challenging. But Ukraine, I see that every single word has a particular importance and content. And the danger of misunderstanding several terms is on the table. That is understandable for me. And when and I hand over to the Ukrainian delegate. Ukrainian territorial, Ukraine territorial regarding Crimea and so on. Yeah, you're right. What I tried is to highlight the new situation nowadays that Russia claims for, that is the new or old normal. They claim all the rights for them, and Ukraine said, we insist on our territorial integrity. It cannot be accepted at all. That is for sure. In reality, we see that Russians went to some of your swimming platforms on the sea, took them over, and now they are the owners of that. Please, owner in brackets. Yeah? So we see some realities on the ground, but I totally agree with you from a Ukrainian perspective. Your territorial integrity and sovereignty is without any discussion. So the problem to us is to demonstrate and to show the different claims from the different actors and to make it visible to people who are not as involved and as informed as others are. That is the challenge I have, and I'm not, everything cannot be right in that, but believe me, we try hard to do so. Excuse if it is not acceptable to you. And security guarantees, of course, Article 5 is the strongest part of it. It is not feasible because full membership is not expectable in the foreseeable future. But what I meant is also below Article 5, on bilateral basis, for example, a greater support in military procurement and so on and so forth. That is also, for me, some part of security guarantee in order to say, if you come stronger under pressure, we will stand on your side and we will deliver some military material and so on and so forth. So it is below Article 5, that's for sure, but it is some kind of security guarantee in my understanding also. And NATO and Black Sea, the question goes to Turkey, I would say. The biggest question to me in that context is, the position of Turkey within NATO, how to handle that new S-400 system being a full member of NATO, and what can it have as a political impact. And I cannot give a recommendation from a landlocked country like Austria. We do not have any single boat nowadays. Yeah, we sold the last two some years ago already. So, but the situation in the Black Sea is a very particular one. Yeah? Due to international regulations, only the neighboring, the Rim countries are able and are allowed to have their own navy and to contribute to the security from their understanding. So the question mainly, if you have a stronger Russia, goes to Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. What they intend to do in the framework of NATO to encounter the new strength of Russia in the Black Sea region.
And Mr. Kandelsky of Georgia, followed by Mr. Yildiz of Turkey. Mr. Kandelsky. At least I got it right this time.
Kandelaki. One term that may be useful for this discussion is from the international law is called effective control. Some individuals fighting on the other side may be actually Russian officers, some maybe not. But the key thing, more important than that, is whether all of them are part of the chain of command of the Russian armed forces. And the term to describe that they are is called effective control. And of course, we have a good analogy from which we use in international courts, and our current government has stopped this. But anyway, we proved that these individuals who are in charge of these military structures were part of the Russian army's chain of command. Some of them would resign prior to taking these positions, like the so-called defense minister of South Ossetia was deputy commander of Russian armed forces in Siberia. He resigned, he came back, became so-called defense minister, then he went back and resumed his post. In fact, he formally never left. So perhaps incorporation of this term would be useful. Thank you.
And Mr. Yildiz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As General rightfully indicated, that the Syria and Ukraine issues are linked in terms of the Russian behavior affecting each other. So all allies should keep that into consideration and take their responsibilities on Syria. We always talk about Ukraine, do something trying to do, but not on Syria. This is the pessimistic part of my comment, but let me make you more optimistic. Although we have practical relations with Russia, we always remember and remind them that we are a NATO member and in all levels. And as Ukrainian colleagues know that we always openly tell them we will never recognize annexation of Crimea. But giving an example on Syria, for example, unfortunately, the statements by President Trump on possible recognition of annexation of Golan by Israel gave another leverage to regime and Russia there. On one hand, we are talking in NATO forums, fora, denying the annexation, recognition of illegal annexation of Crimea, but we are talking on the other hand on recognition of another illegal annexation by force. On S-400s, of course, that it was a deal, cost-effective deal, but we still expect that our NATO colleagues to discuss with us how these S-400 systems will negatively affect the NATO systems. Our technical force that it can be addressed, but it should be seriously discussed among allies, not challenges or threats. Thank you.
And your response?
Some remark on the term effective control. I think it could be a useful term in that context, and what I was told by Ukrainian representatives during my last visit was that it is clear for them that every higher position in the area, in the contested area, is under the control of a former or recent Russian soldier, officer. That is clear to them, and they have some evidence on that. Though the chain of command, as it was mentioned, it is a term in the military language. It says one has the saying, and it has to go through the chain of command to the last one, and he has also to do, and everyone has to do in that context. This chain of command is, for the Ukrainian side, and I think to many observers, evident in that context. The second point, Turkey is a reliable partner in NATO. I think that is a very important message to many of the NATO members, and you're also aware that the procurement of the S-400 system, United States is not amused about that as one of the strongest NATO partners in this context, and it is up to Turkey to convince all the NATO partners that it is in that mind, as you mentioned and you declared. Just another notion in that, because you compared Syria and Ukraine and the Golan Heights in that context, we are living in a multipolar world. And I do not use the term we nowadays, because first you have to define who is we. I do not know in that context, you have different we's in this regard, and that is the starting point for any discussion today. We are not united, we are we's.
Trying to mitigate my pessimism. I mean, what is the? I mean, there is some anecdotal evidence that the good people of the Crimea have not received the flagons of wine and the bottles of honey and all that they were promised. Is that so? And what is the attitude of the people in the contested area who find themselves not directly engaged, but at least find their lives affected by the continuing conflict? I mean, perhaps to put it a little more simply, is there public support in the Crimea for being part of Russia? And is there public support in the contested area for finding itself engaged or a participant, not a participant, but being affected by the continuing conflict?
You're using a different terminology. Contested area, and the other one is non-governmental controlled area, if I'm right, from the Ukrainian, from the Kiev terminology. So that is one example of how careful you have to be in using terminology.
Well,
but
can we call it disputed? Can we call it disputed territory?
I think it's not acceptable for them. But the living standards and the living conditions for the people are totally different on the Crimean Peninsula and in the non-governmental controlled area in the eastern part, in the Donbass. Because I saw people waiting for hours in order to cross above a bridge to come to the Ukrainian territory to get a pension, to get a health treatment, and so on, or to go to a supermarket, for example, and to go back, taking them another several hours. So the living standards in the eastern part, in the Donbass, are, from my understanding, not comparable to that on the Crimean Peninsula. Also, honey is not on the daily template, I would say, in the Crimea area, on the Crimean Peninsula. But the situation in the eastern part what can people there do in order to better their life? I would say nothing. They are totally dependent on the political and military situation in the region. They are heavily affected. Hundreds of thousands of people are heavily affected by the violent conflict in that region, and they are waiting for a political solution, a step forward in the right direction to ease their life, to better their life. So I think it is not really comparable in the two different locations.
Well, thank you for that. You've certainly left me with a lot more to think about than when we began, I must say. Thank you very much indeed. It has been most interesting. You quite rightly acknowledged that you were the last speaker, but you certainly kept us more than awake, kept us on our toes, and we're very grateful. Thank you very much indeed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, technically item 12 is any other business. No item of other business has been advised to me, so I'm assuming there is none. The date and the place of the next meeting is, of course, to be found in London in October. I can't remember the precise dates that the committee will meet, but of course it's a full session, and therefore we will meet on 2 days. So come prepared. The other thing I'd like to say on behalf of the committee is to thank all of those who have been guest speakers, to thank all of you who have contributed to what I think has been a most stimulating day, and also to thank our Slovak colleagues and their staff for all of the hard and, if I may say, cheerful work they have put in organising the 2019 spring session. Can I thank our interpreters?
Thank you, Chairman.
I don't know how you interpret applause, but you certainly deserve it. And also, his ears will be burning after Rainier Andrzejczuk's paean of praise, but Stefan Sachs, the committee director, Genevieve Sponzili, and Angelica Puntel and Clara Durovray, who have done so much to make sure that the mechanics of this meeting work both properly and smoothly. With that, and in the absence of any other business, I declare this meeting, the spring meeting of the Political Committee, over, and I look forward to welcoming you all in London in October.
Great.